10 months earlier, my wife had walked into her boss's office as an employee. She walked out unemployed because she refused to sleep with him. At least, that was what I believed had happened when Emma finally told me the truth. At first, I thought I understood the situation. A powerful executive had crossed a line, my wife had rejected him, and he had retaliated by taking away her job. But as the months passed, I discovered that the story was much bigger than the argument inside that office. There were questions I couldn't answer. What exactly had Richard asked my wife to do? Why had he been so confident that he could fire her and make everyone believe his version of events? Why had the company initially accepted his explanation without questioning the timing? And how had a woman who had simply tried to protect her marriage, her dignity, and her career eventually become connected to the downfall of the man who believed he could control all three? At the time, neither of us knew that the firing would become the first piece of evidence in a chain of events that would eventually threaten everything her boss had built. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Daniel Carter, and for months I had struggled with one question that refused to leave me alone. Why her? Emma had never been the loudest person in a room. She wasn't someone who enjoyed conflict, and she certainly wasn't the kind of employee who walked into an executive office looking for trouble. She was 34 years old, careful with her words, serious about her work, and proud of the life we had built together. We had been married for almost 8 years. Our life wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. We paid our bills, planned our weekends, argued about small things, laughed about even smaller things, and tried to build a future without asking anyone else for permission. Emma's career was an important part of that future. She had spent years earning the position she held at Lawson Strategic Services, a company that provided specialized consulting and operational services to businesses across several states. She had started near the bottom and worked her way into a position where people trusted her judgment. She wasn't there because she knew the right people. She was there because she had earned it. Richard Lawson was different. He had spent more than a decade turning a relatively small operation into a respected company. From the outside, he appeared disciplined, intelligent, and confident. Business magazines had featured him. Industry groups had invited him to speak. Employees described him as demanding, but successful. He dressed carefully, spoke with certainty, and seemed to know exactly how to make people believe he had the answer before anyone else had even understood the question. When Emma first told me about him, there was nothing unusual in her description. She considered him difficult sometimes, but she respected what he had accomplished. She told me that he expected a lot from his employees, and I remember telling her that demanding bosses were common. Neither of us had any reason to think that one of those conversations would eventually change our lives. Emma had been with the company for almost 6 years when things began to change. The first signs were small enough to dismiss. Richard started complimenting her more often. At first, his comments sounded professional. He praised her presentation skills. He told her she had a strong presence in meetings. He said clients responded well to her. None of that seemed unusual. Then the compliments became more personal. He began commenting on how she looked after work events. He asked questions about our marriage. He wanted to know whether I traveled often for work, whether we had children, and whether our relationship was happy. Emma didn't understand why her boss needed that information. She answered some questions politely and avoided others. She assumed he was simply being overly familiar, and because nothing explicitly inappropriate had happened, she didn't think there was a reason to make a formal complaint. That changed one evening when Richard sent her a message after working hours. Emma was sitting on our couch when her phone lit up. I was in the kitchen making dinner, and she looked at the screen for several seconds without responding. When I walked into the room, she turned the phone over. I asked who had messaged her. She said it was Richard. I remember joking that her boss seemed incapable of respecting office hours. She smiled, but it didn't look natural. I asked whether something was wrong. She told me it was nothing. Looking back, That was the first moment I should have realized that she was already uncomfortable. Emma wasn't hiding something from me because she had done anything wrong. She was trying to decide whether what was happening was serious enough to disturb the peace of our home. Over the following weeks, Richard's attention became harder to ignore. He began finding reasons to speak with Emma privately. Meetings that could have involved several people suddenly became one-on-one conversations. He started sending messages that had little to do with work. He asked her to meet him for drinks after business events. Emma repeatedly declined. She never encouraged him. She never gave him the impression that she was interested. If anything, she became more distant. She started leaving the office as soon as her responsibilities allowed and stopped responding to messages unless they concerned work. She believed that creating distance would make the situation disappear. But Richard appeared to interpret her distance as a challenge rather than a boundary. One Friday afternoon, Emma told me she had been asked to stay behind after the rest of her team left. Richard wanted to discuss her future with the company. At first, she was pleased. She thought perhaps he was finally considering her for a promotion. She had been working toward a senior management position, and her performance reviews had been strong. She came home that evening and told me that Richard had spoken about her potential. He had said she was talented. He had said she could go much further. He had talked about compensation and responsibility. Everything sounded positive until Emma reached the part that made her pause. Richard had told her that there were opportunities available to people who understood how relationships worked. Emma didn't understand what he meant at first. Then he explained. He wanted a relationship with her. Not a professional relationship. Not mentorship. Something personal. Something that would require her to cross a line she had no intention of crossing. Emma told him she was married. Richard reportedly smiled and told her that marriage didn't have to complicate things. He spoke as if the problem wasn't his request, but her hesitation. He reminded her that he controlled her position inside the company. He told her that people who understood how to handle situations like this tended to move ahead faster than people who made everything complicated. Emma looked at him and gave him the answer she had already decided on. No. Richard apparently didn't accept it. He asked whether she was sure. She said yes. He asked whether she understood what refusing him could mean for her career. That was when Emma understood that this wasn't simply an inappropriate proposition anymore. It was a warning. She stood up. She told him she had come into his office to discuss her work, not her marriage. Then she walked out. When Emma told me what happened that night, I remember feeling several emotions at once. Anger was the strongest, but underneath it was fear. I knew what Richard's position was. I knew how much influence he had inside the company. And I knew that Emma's career depended on a man she had just rejected. I wanted to call him immediately. I wanted to demand an explanation. But Emma stopped me. She said she didn't want me to make the situation worse. She wanted to handle it professionally. She believed that if she kept doing her job and refused to participate in whatever Richard was trying to create, eventually he would realize that she wasn't interested and move on. For a few days, it appeared that she might have been right. Then everything changed. Emma's next performance review was different. The woman who had previously been described as reliable was suddenly being described as difficult. Tasks that had never been criticized were now being questioned. Decisions she had made with managerial approval were suddenly being presented as errors. Deadlines that had been changed by other departments were placed on her record as failures. Emma began keeping copies of everything. Emails, meeting requests, performance notes, messages. She didn't know exactly why she was doing it. She simply had the feeling that she needed a record of what was happening. Then one morning, Richard called her into his office. There was another person in the room. Human resources. Emma knew immediately that something was wrong. She sat down. Richard told her that the company had decided to terminate her employment. The official explanation was performance. Emma asked what performance issue had led to the decision. Richard referred to several alleged shortcomings. Emma knew some of them were false. She asked why she had never received a formal warning. The room became quiet. She asked why her previous evaluations had been positive. No one gave her a clear answer. Then Richard said something that Emma would remember for the rest of her life. He told her that she should have considered the consequences of the choices she had made. Emma looked at him. She knew exactly what he meant. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She didn't tell him he was wrong. She simply gathered her belongings, walked out of the office, and carried a cardboard box through the building where she had spent nearly 6 years building a career. When she reached the parking lot, she called me. I answered immediately. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she said 4 words. "Daniel, they fired me." I asked why. She began crying. And when she finally told me what had happened, I understood that the box she was carrying wasn't simply filled with office supplies. It contained the career she had spent years building. But neither of us understood yet that the termination would leave behind something much more difficult for Richard Lawson to erase. A record, a timeline, and eventually, questions that would reach far beyond one woman's employment. The first night after Emma lost her job, she barely ate. She sat at the kitchen table with the termination papers in front of her and kept reading the same paragraphs as if the words might change. I remember watching her because I didn't know what to say. I had seen Emma angry before. I had seen her frustrated. I had seen her cry over family problems and difficult days. But this was different. She wasn't only grieving the loss of her income. She was questioning herself. She kept asking whether she had handled the situation correctly, whether she should have stayed quiet, whether she should have agreed to meet Richard outside work, whether saying no had been worth losing everything she had worked for. That was the moment I realized how dangerous retaliation could be. The person who had created the problem had somehow convinced the person he hurt that she was responsible for it. I told Emma something that night that would become important later. "You didn't lose your job because you said no," I told her. "You lost it because somebody believed your no should have had a price." She looked at me but didn't answer. The next morning, we started with something simple. We wrote down the timeline, the first message, the private meetings, the proposition, her refusal, the change in her treatment, the performance concerns, the termination. We didn't know whether it would matter. We didn't know whether anyone would believe her. We didn't even know whether Richard had kept records that could prove or disprove what she remembered. But Emma had learned something during those first painful days. If she was going to tell her story, she needed more than emotion. She needed facts. And that decision would eventually take her somewhere neither of us expected. Because while Emma was searching through her own records, she discovered the name of another former employee who had left the company under circumstances that looked strangely familiar. Her name was Sarah Bennett, and Sarah had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. Sarah Bennett was the first person who made Emma question whether what happened to her had really been an isolated incident. Emma found Sarah's name in an old professional networking profile and spent nearly an hour staring at the screen before finally deciding to send her a message. She kept it simple. She didn't accuse Richard Lawson of anything. She didn't describe every detail of her own experience. She simply said that she had worked at the company, that she had recently left, and that she wanted to ask about something that had happened there. Sarah didn't respond that day. She didn't respond the next day either. 3 days later, Emma received a message that contained only one sentence. "I don't know if I want to talk about him again." Emma understood immediately. Whatever had happened to Sarah, it had left a mark. She replied that she understood and that she wouldn't pressure her. Almost an hour passed before Sarah sent another message. "If you're asking because something happened to you too, then we should talk." They met at a quiet coffee shop on a Saturday afternoon. Emma went alone. I wanted to go with her, but she told me that Sarah might be more comfortable speaking privately. When Emma returned several hours later, she looked exhausted. She placed her bag on the table, sat down, and remained silent for a moment. Then she told me that Sarah's story had started almost exactly the same way hers had. Sarah had worked for Richard for 4 years. She had received excellent evaluations during her first 3 years. Then Richard began paying unusual attention to her. He invited her to private dinners connected to business trips. He told her that she had potential. He suggested that her career could move faster if she became more personally available to him. Sarah rejected him. After that, her work suddenly wasn't good enough. Complaints appeared. Meetings became uncomfortable. Her responsibilities were reduced. Eventually, she was dismissed. But Sarah had done something Emma hadn't thought to do at the time. She had kept copies of several internal documents. One document was particularly important. It was an email Sarah had received from a senior manager several months before her termination. The email praised her work and specifically stated that management was pleased with her performance. Another document, dated only weeks later, described her as unreliable and unsuitable for advancement. The difference between the two documents was difficult to explain. Sarah also had messages showing that Richard had contacted her privately before her performance suddenly deteriorated. Emma didn't know whether those documents were enough to prove anything, but she understood why Sarah had been afraid to speak. Sarah told her that after leaving the company, she had tried to forget everything. She found another job, moved forward, and stopped talking about Richard. She believed that reopening the matter would only drag her back into a period of her life she desperately wanted to leave behind. Then Emma appeared. For the first time, Sarah realized she wasn't the only person who had experienced the same pattern. Emma returned home that evening carrying copies of documents Sarah had agreed to share with her attorney. She didn't celebrate. She didn't feel victorious. Instead, she sat quietly beside me and said, "Daniel, what if this has happened to more people?" That question changed the direction of everything. Until that moment, we had been dealing with one woman's termination. Now there was a possibility that Emma's experience was part of something larger. Her attorney told her not to make public accusations and not to contact former employees indiscriminately. The safest thing was to preserve evidence and allow the appropriate authorities to determine whether there was a broader issue. Emma followed that advice. She stopped looking for revenge and started looking for answers. Over the next several weeks, additional former employees came forward through private channels. Some had stories about inappropriate conduct. Others described questionable management decisions. A few refused to speak at all. But one thing kept appearing in different accounts. Employees who challenged Richard's authority often found their careers suddenly changing. The company, however, looked perfectly healthy from the outside. Richard continued appearing at business events. He posted photographs from conferences. He gave interviews about leadership and workplace culture. He talked about integrity, professionalism, and the importance of building strong teams. To anyone watching from outside, there was no obvious sign that anything was wrong. Emma found that especially difficult. She would sometimes see a photograph of Richard online and remember the man who had sat across from her and told her that refusing him could have consequences. She wondered how someone could present himself as a champion of professional ethics while behaving so differently behind closed doors. But she also knew that appearances were not evidence. Her attorney reminded her repeatedly that the truth had to be established through records, witnesses, and proper investigation. So Emma waited. Then something happened that neither of us expected. A regulatory concern involving Richard's company surfaced independently of Emma's complaint. The company operated in an industry where maintaining an active operating license required compliance with strict standards. There were rules governing documentation, employee reporting procedures, internal oversight, and professional conduct. A complaint had been submitted concerning one aspect of the company's operations, and regulators began asking questions. At first, Richard treated the inquiry as routine. Companies in regulated industries received requests for information all the time. He assured employees that everything was under control. But investigators began requesting records covering a period that included the time Emma and Sarah had worked there. That was when the situation changed. Emma's attorney learned that the regulators were reviewing more than one issue. Nobody told Emma that her complaint had caused the investigation, because that would have been premature and potentially misleading. Instead, her attorney explained that the regulatory process could uncover information relevant to her case. Emma was told to preserve everything. She did. Every email, every message, every performance review. every document relating to her termination. She even kept the cardboard box from the day she was fired. I remember asking her why she still had it. She said she didn't know. Maybe she needed proof that the day had actually happened. Maybe part of her still couldn't believe that 6 years of work had ended in a single afternoon. For the next several months, almost nothing happened publicly. Richard continued operating. Emma continued looking for work. Sarah tried to move on. The investigation proceeded quietly. There were no dramatic headlines. No television cameras outside the company. No public announcement explaining what regulators were doing. This was perhaps the hardest part for Emma. She had told the truth, preserved evidence, and followed every instruction she had been given. Yet Richard appeared to be living normally. Sometimes Emma would ask whether she had made a mistake by fighting the termination. Sometimes she wondered whether she should have simply accepted the severance and walked away. I would remind her that she had done nothing wrong, but reassurance doesn't always erase doubt. There were nights when she sat awake wondering whether standing up for herself had cost her too much. Then, about 5 months after the firing, Emma received an unexpected opportunity. Another company offered her a position. It wasn't as senior as her previous role, and the salary was initially lower, but it was a fresh start. She accepted. Slowly, her confidence returned. Her new manager valued her work. She began receiving positive feedback again. One evening, she came home smiling because someone at work had praised a report she had prepared. It was a small moment, but I could see what it meant to her. For months, Richard's version of her had been hanging over her. Now someone who had never met him was judging her based on her actual work. That was when Emma began understanding that losing one job did not mean losing her career. But Richard's situation was moving in the opposite direction. By the 7th month, investigators had requested additional records from the company. Some documents concerned compliance procedures. Others involved internal complaints and how management had handled them. Employees were reportedly being interviewed. Former employees were being contacted. The company began bringing in outside legal advisors. Richard became less visible publicly. His social media activity slowed. Events he had once attended regularly no longer featured him. People who had once praised his leadership became cautious when his name came up. Still, there was no final decision. No license suspension. No public finding. Just an investigation moving through a process that could not be rushed. Then, in the 8th month, something appeared in the records that changed the significance of Emma's termination. Investigators discovered that the company had received previous complaints about management conduct. Some had been handled informally. Others had never been properly documented. One internal record showed that concerns about Richard's behavior had been raised before Emma ever entered his office that day. Another document suggested that management had discussed employee complaints without establishing a consistent procedure for investigating them. The issue was no longer simply whether Richard had behaved improperly toward one employee. Regulators were now examining whether the company had allowed a culture to develop in which complaints could be ignored or punished. Emma didn't know what would happen next. Her attorney told her not to expect immediate results. Investigations take time. Evidence has to be reviewed. People have to be interviewed. Companies have the right to respond. Nothing should be assumed before a final determination. Emma understood that. She also understood that the truth wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it existed quietly inside documents that nobody noticed until the right person asked the right question. The 9th month was almost completely silent. Emma had begun to think about the investigation less often. Her new job was demanding. Our life had returned to something resembling normal. We went out for dinner. We made weekend plans. We started talking about vacations again. Richard Lawson was becoming a distant memory. Then, on a Monday morning, Emma received an email from her attorney. The message wasn't long. It said that there had been developments in the regulatory matter and that they would speak later that week. Emma read it twice. She didn't call immediately. She had learned not to expect anything. 10 months of waiting had taught her that hope could be exhausting. Then came the morning that opened this story. It was a Tuesday. Emma and I were sitting across from each other at the kitchen table. She had a cup of coffee in her hands. I was checking my phone. The message came from a former colleague who still worked in the industry. Richard Lawson's company had been placed under major regulatory restrictions. His operating license had been suspended pending the outcome of the regulatory process. I read the message again because I wasn't sure I had understood it. Then I looked at Emma. She immediately knew something had happened. "What is it?" she asked. I turned the phone toward her. She read the message. For several seconds, she said nothing. I expected her to smile. She didn't. I expected anger. There wasn't any. Instead, she whispered, "I didn't want this." That sentence stayed with me. Because Emma had spent 10 months fighting to be heard, but she had never wanted another person's destruction. She had wanted accountability. There is a difference. The investigators had not suspended Richard's license because Emma had demanded it. They had done so after examining a broader collection of regulatory and management concerns. Her experience was one piece of the record, not the entire case. And then we learned something even more important. The investigators had examined the timeline surrounding Emma's firing, her previous performance evaluations, the sudden criticism, the private meetings, the termination, the company's handling of her complaint, and the records connected to other former employees. The timeline raised questions Richard could not easily answer. Before Emma rejected him, her performance record had been strong. After she rejected him, the criticisms began. Then came her termination. The official reason had been performance. But the documents told a more complicated story. That did not automatically prove every allegation. It did not mean every problem at the company was caused by Richard personally, but it created a pattern that investigators could examine. And once the records were placed side by side, the differences were difficult to ignore. Richard's representatives argued that Emma's termination had been based entirely on legitimate business concerns. They maintained that her employment decision had nothing to do with personal matters. They disputed some of the allegations and challenged the interpretation of certain records. That response was expected. Richard was entitled to defend himself. But investigators had something he could not control: dates, emails, performance evaluations, messages, witness accounts, and records created before anyone knew they would eventually be examined. That was the part that changed everything. For years, Richard had operated as though his position gave him control over the narrative. If an employee complained, management could describe the complaint as a misunderstanding. If someone was terminated, the company could point to performance. If someone challenged a decision, the organization could defend its internal process. But documents have no loyalty. They don't care who is powerful. They don't care who speaks more confidently in a meeting. A document created months earlier can sometimes tell a different story from the explanation offered afterward. Then came the final piece. An internal communication from the period immediately surrounding Emma's termination showed that Richard had discussed her situation with another executive. The communication did not contain the dramatic confession anyone might expect. There was no sentence saying, "Fire her because she rejected me." Real life rarely provides evidence that neatly. Instead, the document contained language that investigators could compare with the timeline. It showed that Richard had become personally frustrated with Emma before the performance concerns suddenly escalated. That mattered because the company had repeatedly insisted that the termination had been a routine professional decision. When Emma learned about the document, she cried. Not because Richard was finally being punished, because she remembered the day she had walked out carrying that box. For 10 months, part of her had wondered whether maybe she really had failed. Now there was something outside her own memory telling her that the story was more complicated than the one she had been given. The regulatory process continued. Richard's operating license remained suspended while the matter was reviewed. The company faced serious financial and operational pressure. Employees who had once considered the organization secure began looking elsewhere. Clients became cautious. Partners requested explanations. The reputation Richard had spent years building began to change. And then Richard called Emma. She almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, but when she picked up, she recognized his voice immediately. Emma. She said nothing. Richard paused. For the first time since she had known him, he didn't sound confident. He asked how she was doing. Emma didn't answer the question. Instead, she asked why he was calling. He said he wanted to apologize. Emma listened. He told her that he had handled the situation badly. He said he had allowed his personal feelings to interfere with a professional relationship. He said he regretted the way he had treated her. Emma remained silent. Then she asked him the question she had been carrying for 10 months. Why did you fire me? There was a long pause. Richard finally said that he had been angry. Emma asked, because I rejected you? Another pause. Then he admitted it. Not in the dramatic way a movie confession might happen. His voice was quiet. He said he had felt embarrassed and believed she had disrespected him. Emma almost laughed, but she didn't. She told him that she had never disrespected him. She had simply said no. Then she said something that I believe Richard needed to hear. You didn't fire me because I was a bad employee. You fired me because you thought you had the right to punish me for refusing you. Richard didn't answer. Emma told him that she hoped he would learn from what happened. Then she ended the call. She never called him again. Months later, the regulatory proceedings continued to unfold, and the company faced the consequences of the findings made against it. The exact outcome of every allegation varied, but the suspension of the operating license had already changed Richard's world. The man who had once seemed untouchable now had to answer questions he had spent years avoiding. The company had to confront failures in its systems and leadership. Former employees had to decide whether they were willing to speak, and Emma had to decide what she wanted to do with the life she had rebuilt. She chose not to make Richard the center of that life. That may have been the most important decision she made. She stayed at her new job. Her confidence returned. She began mentoring younger employees. Eventually, she spoke privately with people who had experienced similar workplace situations. She didn't tell them what decision to make. She simply told them to document what happened, seek appropriate professional advice, and never assume that someone else's title makes their behavior acceptable. Sarah also moved forward. The two women remained in contact, but neither wanted their friendship to be defined entirely by what Richard had done. They had met because of a painful experience, but they eventually became reminders to each other that a difficult chapter did not have to become the entire story. As for me, I learned something too. Before this happened, I thought justice meant seeing the person who hurt you suffer. After watching Emma go through those 10 months, I realized it could mean something else. Sometimes justice is simply having the truth recognized. Sometimes it is knowing that the version of events someone used to destroy your confidence was never the whole truth. Sometimes it is getting another opportunity after someone tried to convince you that you didn't deserve one. And sometimes, consequences arrive without you having to chase them. Richard Lawson had believed that firing Emma would end the problem. He was wrong. But Emma didn't win because Richard lost his license. She won because he never convinced her that saying no was something she should regret. 10 months earlier, she had walked out of that office carrying a cardboard box, wondering whether her career had just been destroyed. 10 months later, the man who had believed he controlled her future was fighting to keep control of his own. And somewhere between those two moments was a lesson neither of us expected to learn. Power can make people believe they control the story, but records can preserve what really happened. People can remain silent for years, but eventually, someone may decide to speak. A complaint can be ignored. Another complaint can follow. A document can sit in a file. Another document can sit beside it. And one day, someone looks at all of them together and realizes that what appeared to be separate incidents may actually be part of a larger pattern. That was what happened to Emma. She didn't set out to bring down Richard Lawson. She didn't create the investigation. She didn't suspend his license. She didn't destroy his company. She simply refused to give him something he believed his position entitled him to have: her dignity. And when he tried to punish her for protecting it, she documented what happened and refused to let his version become the only version. That was enough. Looking back, I sometimes think about the morning she came home carrying that box. She had believed she was walking away from the most painful day of her career. She couldn't have known that the same day would eventually become one of the most important dates in an investigation into the company she had worked for. She couldn't have known that another employee had already experienced something similar. She couldn't have known that regulators would eventually examine records surrounding the company. And she certainly couldn't have known that 10 months later, her former boss would no longer be operating with the authority he once believed was permanent. But perhaps the most important part of the story isn't what happened to Richard. It's what didn't happen to Emma. He didn't destroy her career. He didn't destroy her marriage. He didn't take away her ability to trust herself. For a while, he came close. But Emma rebuilt. And when she finally looked back, she understood that the day she thought she had lost everything was actually the day she began taking back control of her own story. There is a reason stories like this stay with us. Because most people will never sit inside an executive office and face the exact decision Emma faced. But many people know what it feels like to be pressured by someone with more authority. They know what it feels like to wonder whether speaking up will cost them something. They know what it feels like to question themselves after someone else crosses a boundary. And they know how frightening it can be to choose integrity when the easier choice seems to be silence. Emma's story reminds us that saying no can sometimes have a cost. But that doesn't mean the person who says no is wrong. The cost of silence can be even greater. And when someone uses power to punish another person for refusing them, the consequences may not appear immediately. Sometimes they take months. Sometimes they take years. Sometimes they begin with something as small as an email saved on a computer, a message on a phone, a performance review, a date on a calendar, a former employee who finally says, "This happened to me too." And sometimes, when those pieces finally come together, the story looks very different from the one people were told at the beginning. 10 months after Emma lost her job, Richard Lawson's company was no longer operating the way it had before. But Emma was. She was working. She was rebuilding. She was laughing again. And one evening, months after the call from Richard, I asked her whether she ever wished she had handled things differently. She thought about it. Then she shook her head. "No," she said. "I wish it had never happened. But I don't wish I had said yes." That answer told me everything. Because she wasn't celebrating what happened to him. She was simply refusing to apologize for what she had done to protect herself. And maybe that is the part of this story worth remembering. Sometimes you don't know the importance of a decision when you make it. You only understand years, months, or even days later. Emma's decision took less than a minute. Richard asked. She said no. He believed he could punish her. He fired her. And for 10 months, it looked as though he had won. But the story didn't end in that parking lot. It didn't end with the cardboard box. It didn't end with the termination letter. It continued through emails, records, witnesses, questions, investigations, and people who finally found the courage to speak. And 10 months later, the man who thought firing Emma would make the problem disappear was the one answering questions about the company he had spent years building. So if there is one thing I want you to remember from Emma's story, it is this. Never confuse someone's authority with their right to control you. A job can be replaced. A title can disappear. A company can change. A career can be rebuilt. But when you surrender your boundaries because someone powerful tells you that you have no choice, you may spend much longer trying to recover the part of yourself you gave away. Emma refused. She lost her job, but she kept herself. And 10 months later, the world around her finally began to catch up with the truth. If you were in Emma's position, what would you have done? Would you have reported Richard immediately, documented everything quietly, confronted him, or walked away and tried to rebuild your life somewhere else? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you would have done in her position. And if this story made you think about how much courage it sometimes takes to stand up for yourself, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our upcoming stories. Because sometimes the person who looks like they have lost everything is actually the person who walked away with the one thing that mattered most. The ability to look back without regretting the moment They chose their own dignity.